Mr. Davis has failed to provide full disclosure of his assets, deliberately concealing the funds in the offshore account.
The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. It wasn't just another divorce trial. It felt like a battle for something far deeper: my dignity. My wife, once my partner, now sat across from me, her cold gaze sharp enough to cut through the silence. The walls felt closer, almost suffocating, as I tried to focus on what the lawyers were saying. But it was hard to think straight when the woman who once promised to stand by me was now trying to tear me apart. The courtroom itself, with its high ceilings and sterile, gray atmosphere, seemed to magnify every emotion I felt. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, louder than the voices of the lawyers or the murmurs from the gallery. I had always imagined this day differently, maybe with less bitterness, more resolution. But here I was, drowning in an ocean of regret and frustration. Then came the moment when everything changed. It wasn't a legal argument, a shocking piece of evidence, or an emotional breakdown that shifted the tides. It was something far simpler, far more personal. In a room full of people, my wife laughed at me, and in that instant I realized I had to do something bold, something unexpected. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the start of what I knew would be the most difficult few hours of my life. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, glanced over his glasses as he called the case. His voice was steady, almost mechanical, but I could hear the underlying weight in his words. This wasn't just about property, custody, or money. This was a matter of finality, of closing a chapter on a relationship that had once meant everything to me. I sat stiffly in my seat, trying to appear composed. My lawyer, a woman who was as sharp as she was efficient, shuffled through her papers, preparing for the arguments that would unfold. Across from me, my wife and her lawyer exchanged quiet words, their side of the room feeling distant and foreign. It felt surreal, as if we were both playing roles in a tragedy we couldn't escape. My wife, in particular, was hard to read. There was a coldness to her that I had never seen before. The woman I had once known as compassionate and loving now seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. She sat with her arms crossed, her face expressionless, save for the occasional glance in my direction. I couldn't help but notice the way she held herself so confident, as if the outcome was already decided in her favor. The trial began in a typical fashion. The lawyer from my wife's side made their opening statements, painting a picture of incompatibility, financial struggles, and emotional distance. I expected this. It was the same narrative she had shared with her friends and family. But hearing it in this cold, formal setting felt different. It made everything feel so final. But it wasn't the lawyer's words that stuck with me. It was the way my wife looked at me, like she had already won. And that's when I realized maybe I wasn't going to win this in the way I thought I would. It happened when the room had momentarily quieted after the lawyers finished their statements. The judge, who had been listening intently, paused to collect his thoughts. In that silence, my wife's voice broke through, cutting the air like a knife. She laughed. It wasn't a chuckle, nor was it the sound of relief. It was a sharp, unmistakable laugh, filled with mockery, as if she had just heard the most absurd thing. Her lawyer was speaking, but her eyes were locked on me, and she leaned back in her chair with that same cold smirk. It was a laugh that echoed not just in my ears, but deep within my chest, resonating like a cruel reminder of everything I had failed to do, of everything she had come to believe I was. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath for a second. The judge's brow furrowed, the audience shifted uneasily, and even my lawyer looked momentarily thrown off. But it was a silence that followed that made my skin prickle. No one knew what to say or do. There was an awkward tension. But in that moment, I was no longer just a man sitting across from his wife in a legal battle. I was the joke. And for a split second, I felt small, humiliated. But then something inside me snapped. I couldn't just sit there and let it go. The silence was deafening, but it was the perfect moment for something unexpected, something bold. It started with a decision, one I didn't fully understand at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I had to take control of the room, of the narrative. I couldn't let her laughter define me. So, Without thinking too much about the consequences, I reached for the buttons of my shirt. The courtroom was still, but you could feel the shift as I slowly unbuttoned the top button. Then the second. The sound of the fabric parting was louder than I expected, each pop of the button creating an almost cinematic tension. I could hear the faint rustling of people shifting in their seats, whispers flickering between them, unsure what to make of my actions. Was this a breakdown? A sign of madness? Or something more deliberate? As the shirt came off, I could sense all eyes on me. My wife's face froze. The smirk that had been there moments ago was replaced by a flicker of confusion. She didn't understand what was happening, and that gave me a small measure of satisfaction. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble in the way she expected. I was showing her, no, showing everyone, that I still had power over my own story. My lawyer looked startled, but I caught a glance of approval in her eyes. The judge? He looked both confused and intrigued, but said nothing. The room had become utterly silent, almost as if time had slowed down. This wasn't just a shirt being removed, it was a statement, a defiance against the mockery, a reclaiming of my own dignity. And for the first time in this entire trial, I felt like I had the upper hand. As I stood there, shirtless, the world around me seemed to freeze. The silence in the room was thick, almost tangible. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of every gaze in the room bore down on me. And yet, for the first time since entering this courtroom, I felt a strange sense of control. My wife's eyes were wide now, her lips parted in disbelief. She hadn't expected this. I could see her struggle to process what was happening, the arrogance in her posture fading into uncertainty. It was a small victory, but it was mine. She had laughed at me just moments before, but now it was clear. The dynamics had shifted. The judge didn't say anything immediately, though I noticed the way his fingers drummed lightly on the armrest of his chair. Perhaps he was waiting for me to explain myself, or perhaps he simply didn't know what to make of this unexpected act. The courtroom was filled with professionals, lawyers, clerks, and other observers, yet they all seemed caught off guard. The tension was palpable, and in that moment, I knew I had their attention. I didn't need to say a word. The silence spoke louder than any defense or argument I could have made. My shirtless stance wasn't just about making a statement. It was about breaking the silence she had imposed on me. I was no longer the victim of her laughter. Now, I was the one controlling the narrative. The moments that followed felt like an eternity. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence, but he didn't immediately address my actions. Instead, he motioned for everyone to take a breath, as if unsure of how to proceed. My lawyer quickly stood up, visibly trying to regain control of the room. The court reporter's fingers paused over the keyboard. The entire space seemed suspended in that awkward, thick air. My wife, however, was the most revealing part of the aftermath. Her initial shock had morphed into something close to disbelief. She glanced around the room, her face flushed with confusion, then looked at me as though she were trying to figure out whether I had lost my mind or if there was some deeper meaning to this gesture. It was clear now. She hadn't expected this. Her laughter, once sharp and cutting, now fell hollow, almost desperate in comparison to the quiet tension that hung between us. The judge finally spoke, his voice measured but with a hint of discomfort. He addressed me directly, asking if I was prepared to continue the trial or if I needed a moment. The question felt more like a challenge, as if my actions had shifted something fundamental in the power dynamics of the room. But the damage had already been done. My wife's smirk had vanished. The control she had once held over proceedings and over me was no longer absolute. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, I had reclaimed my dignity, and that silence had spoken louder than any argument ever could. In the end, the trial continued and life moved on. But that moment, when I stood shirtless in the courtroom, would stay with me forever. It wasn't about the divorce, the assets, or the custody battles. It was about reclaiming something that had been lost somewhere along the way, my own sense of self-worth. The courtroom silence had been more powerful than any word spoken that day. It was a loud, undeniable statement that I was still in control of my story. My wife had mocked me, laughed at my pain, but in that instant, I showed her and everyone else that I was more than the man they saw across the table. I was someone who could stand tall, even in the face of humiliation. Though the trial didn't end the way I had hoped, that brief, quiet moment of defiance meant more than any legal victory could have. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in the face of mockery is to remain unapologetically yourself. And as I walked out of that courtroom, shirtless but with my head held high, I knew that I had won something far more valuable than any court ruling. I had won back my dignity, and in the process, I had redefined who I was.